I'd like to welcome and introduce my yoga teacher, Yogarupa Rod Stryker, who is the founder of Para Yoga and the author of The Four Desires. And he's going to be talking to us about understanding how it is that we can begin to use our practice and to use our life experience to create a life of meaning and thriving. Welcome.
Hi, Kathryn. Nice to see you.
It's so great that you're here.
Great
Thanks
great
so
to
much.
meet
So I want to make sure that we understand a little bit of what we've been talking about and how it applies to moving forward in life. And what we've been talking about in our teaching so far is understanding what it is that gets in the way, how we have these problems. And we've been talking about it in terms of our anxieties and our depressions, how life sometimes takes us for an unexpected turn and we have traumas. And sometimes these get expressed through symptoms that create pathology or etiology where we can't move forward in life.
Sure.
And so we've been using things from Western psychology and some concepts from Ayurveda and yoga to help us stabilize, right? So we can not just be alive, but survive life.
Right.
And now we want to look at turning toward thriving. But it seems like anxiety and depression and trauma is like everywhere, right? It's like the new normal is what you've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you see with that? Like how do we understand how that becomes problematic in our ability to move forward in life? We want to thrive, but we can't.
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that the conditions, culturally, societally, even the advancement of technology is actually playing a role in those things you bring up: anxiety, depression. What was the third one you mentioned?
Trauma.
Trauma.
Right.
Well, let's take anxiety and depression. So, partially, there is, I think, a collective sense of almost being denatured. It's something you talk about a lot in Ayurveda, which is just being in tune with the cycles of the day, let alone the seasons. Now, because of technology, lights and electricity,
Right.
already we're taken out. We can be shopping at 2 a.m. And we can be anywhere in the world and getting information. And that actually begins to set up various scenarios. And this
Right.
is something you're addressing in Ayurveda. And so we really have to, in a sense, have an appreciation for the fact that is present. That's a challenge that we all face. And so, again, something we talk about, and you've talked about in Ayurveda, is making wise choices so that we are as close to the rhythms of nature that they intended. And that's a really important thing for people to get as a foundation. But I think in a larger sense, the issue that you're bringing up, we want to speak to about it in terms of the fact is that if we've reached a level in our life where basically we have the opportunity to thrive, we've
Right.
reached this baseline of survival,
Right.
or attained a certain level of stability.
Pay our bills. We know we have a job. We're pretty healthy, right?
Yeah. But then there's this pervasive lack of fulfillment that we find in our culture, and that is something that we want to really address, and that we address in our work with the Four Desires. And that the idea here is it's not just chasing desires, but it's understanding what is desire meant to really be serving. It's looking at all of the roles and obligations that we take on in life. What is the purpose of actually doing it other than surviving?
So here's a question I have for you. So we talk about this like if I'm talking in session with a client or I'm in a yoga class talking to a student and they say, well, everything should be going well. I just got married last year and I'm expecting a child and I'm, I have this great job and I'm unhappy a lot of times, right? And everything in society says this is what I'm supposed to want, or my parents told me I want, or I used to think I wanted. And yet when they speak about this, there's a sense that they're not feeling as if they're really engaging in a way that holds meaning to them, right? And so we talk about this a little bit in other conversations around locus of control. So having your locus of control being outside of you versus being inside of you. So what happens, like what are some of those ideas, especially in the Four Desires work, about what happens with these driving desires that aren't really helping us feel fulfilled?
Well, it's helpful, and I'm glad you brought up the Four Desires in the sense, literally not just the title of a book, but really what are they orienting to us to? And it gives us a sense of context that, look, there are 4 desires, and in brief, there's one, life purpose, fulfilling our life purpose, in a sense, fully flowering in what it is that we're meant to do, as well as what we're meant to contribute to the world. This larger picture, that's one. What you talked about when you started to say, look, I got married, basically we're making a good living, the kids are healthy, that speaks to a second desire, which is the desire for having beauty and comfort in our life, and a sense of comfortable and easy surroundings, satisfying surrounding, and finding delight in our relationships. So that's really vital. The next then is having the means to do it, and that's physical health, as well as enough money in the bank, a sense of a home or a shelter or protection of some kind, a place that we can call our own. So those are three very fundamental desires, but the fourth one is the desire for spiritual fulfillment. And if you look at them, just if we take a step back, you go, really, that is a prescription for a full life.
Right.
Now, if I'm only satisfying two, let's say I'm making a good living, and I have good company and nice things around me,
Right.
there's still going to be a deep longing. And the beautiful contribution that really stirred my soul when I first began to meet the philosophy of the yoga tradition was the fact that they called as much attention to the deeper spiritual fulfillment in our life as well as the material fulfillment.
Right. They're an exclusive of each other.
Not at
Right.
all.
Because people think that sometimes. They think it's not okay to have success in life and feel that fulfillment, that somehow you can't be spiritually fulfilled.
Right.
And that's such a misleading concept.
And the other is that very often people who swing into the yoga or spiritual traditions say, well, then I should no longer want a good relationship. I should no longer need money. And really what we're talking about with the four desires is to the extent that we actually fulfill them, that's called a complete life. And that's truly what we're attempting to empower people to fulfill and to achieve. And the first thing is we have to make peace with the fact that all four desires are perfectly legitimate. And the desire for good company is as important to my well-being as the desire for spiritual liberation. The desire for a creative life that is fulfilling and positively affecting the world and my environment is as important as making money. And once we begin to say, okay, it's an even playing field, that they all need to be honored, what we then want to do is set up on the course of how do we empower ourselves and ultimately perhaps empower others to do that. Right.
So I'm thinking about this idea because I got trapped in this idea, and I get trapped in it all the time, which is I start ranking them. Like one is better than the other, and it usually depends on things that come from my past experience that kind of give me those ideas. And so I know we've talked about this idea that you are your life that you're experiencing now comes from the habits of how you've lived your life. Right, and we talk about this in the ayurveda and the yoga, but in psychology with thought. So how does that work with thoughts? How does it work that what I'm thinking now is creating my future life or my experience of this moment? How does that work? That's a big question.
It's a big question. You see me taking a big breath here.
So let's think about it. Let's just introduce this idea, because one of the things I really love about the work that you're doing and about the way it helped me as a psychotherapist begin to understand, to be of greater use, I think, to my clients and to my yoga students, is to understand the cycle that happens, because it gets set up in such a way that we don't even know it's happening because it plays to our habits. It's hard to get conscious of those things, right? So how does that cycle work, that samskara vasana?
Well, you're really talking, if you wanted to look at the depth psychology of the yoga tradition, this is where we would turn. We would begin to see, and there's really significant overlap between modern psychotherapy and these ancient wisdom. But there are some unique ideas. The first in the yoga tradition that contribute to this understanding. And the first is to understand that the seed of every thought, as well as every desire, as well as every action, is in fact desire. The seed of every thought is a desire. The seed of every action is a desire. And so, yes, we have this pattern of habituation, and it doesn't take much, as you know. If it feels good, you do it twice, chances are you're going to do it again.
Yeah.
And we go unconscious. But let's look at this idea of how we wind up here in, let's say, a fate or what looks like our destiny, be it less than ideal or even ideal or far from ideal. And the idea here is that what we want to understand is that the seed of every action or thought is a desire. The yoga tradition will even go back further, and they'll say, well, the cause of that desire was an experience. And that the word for that, we could say that experience or action that then created a seed desire. The action, we'd call that a karma. So some kind of action, something that's happened to us. that creates an impression. That's called samskara. And the deep samskaras, or the impressions that are more pronounced and more profound, then create intentions, and they create a tendency. And now, we can use this to our advantage. So let me give a couple examples. On the positive side is, you were sitting here with me because you had a positive experience with yoga, and so did I, by the way. And that created an impression, and from that impression, it then generated a desire to want to do more yoga.
Right.
So that cycle works in the positive. At the same time, that cycle also can potentially have negative implications, which is, and this is psychology 101, if I may.
No,
So
please.
from, let's say, a disruptive or unstable childhood, it creates an impression. From that impression, it generates, from that action or circumstance, it generates an impression. And that, our tendency is then we generate a desire out of that. And one of the desires is the desire for the familiar, to sustain the familiar.
Right.
So if something was uncomfortable, or let's even say abusive or traumatic, even though logically it may not make sense to want something that's less than constructive, but very often we'll seek a repetition of the circumstance because it's familiar.
That's right. Yeah.
And not because it feels good, but because it's
Right.
familiar.
We know it.
And
We're afraid.
and because we have a sense of it defining us. Now we want to sustain the definition of us that we are familiar with and understand. And so it creates this cycle. And the yogis call this the karma chakra, which is the wheel of action, which is now we start spinning in this kind of pattern of, now I got my good experience from yoga, now I want to do yoga, now I do yoga, it creates more good experiences, and now 20 years later you're a yoga master and you're teaching the interface of ayurveda, psychology, and yoga, and this is, and you know, and we combine that with other positive experiences. On the other hand, the negative implications are such that we get on this wheel. So much of the work, the pivot of this work, ultimately, of the 4 desires, and truly moving people from surviving to thriving, to me, is understanding not just the label, because I think modern psychotherapy has done amazing things about creating these distinctions in behavioral, you know, and categorizing different kinds of behavior and putting them in context. But really understanding what is the desire that's seeding that either positive and life-affirming behavior, or not so we'll call it non-constructive behavior. So much of a lot of the work is understanding us not as a kind of a label, because I make the case, look, there are people who grow up in very unfortunate circumstances and go on to become incredibly powerful, constructive people. We could say, for instance, that's a child of an alcoholic, but how they spun out of that was on the basis of correcting the seed desire for their future actions and behavior.